is 12 after the hour. So our last speaker for this first session of the day is Stephen Houlgate. He is a professor at the University of Warwick, and he's the author of Hegel on Being, which is due out any minute now, I think, as well as many other works on Hegel and German thought. So he's going to be talking to us about civil society and its discontents, Hegel and the problem of poverty in the modern state. And he has it just popped up in the chat, Nick put it there. This is what he's going to be reading. So you don't need to use that, but if you want to click on it, you can follow along with him.
Good. Thank you, Kate. Right. Well, first of all, thanks to Dean and the co-organizers for putting together this conference. It's been wonderful to hear the papers, but also to re-establish contact with some old friends as well. And thanks to you, Terry, for the enlightenment you've given us over the years and continue to give us. I'm going to respectfully disagree with you in this paper, so I hope that's okay just for this hour. In his masterful Hegel biography, Terry Pinkard writes that Hegel was acutely aware of the problem that extreme poverty poses for civil society, but his philosophy contained no answer to the problem. In this paper, I defend an alternative view that I suggested some years ago, namely that Hegel sees a solution in the corporations. First, though, some general remarks on Hegel's philosophy of right. In my view, Hegel's PR, for shorthand, is not just a rational reconstruction of the modern state, a reconstruction that would look different if the state were to change in the future. The PR is governed by reason or the concept, and sets out the distinctive logic of freedom, what freedom logically must be. Hegel is unequivocal on this point. I quote, "In philosophical cognition, the chief concern is the necessity of a concept. Then, given that its content is necessary for itself, the second step is to look around for what corresponds to it in our representations and language. Representation is thus not the measure and criterion of the concept, but it must derive its truth from the concept and recognize and correct itself, sich berichtigen, with the help of the latter." This is the remarked paragraph 2 of PR. In this sense, the concept of freedom in PR is normative, not just descriptive. It determines what true freedom is and must be, whether or not such freedom is found in the world. Yet, of course, Hegel also insists that reason actualizes itself in the world, and indeed constitutes actuality itself. Hence, Hegel's Doppelsatz, what is rational is actual, and what is actual is rational. Accordingly, in his philosophy of history, which follows PR, he shows how true freedom has become a historical reality in modern constitutional states. He shows, however, that states such as Britain and France embody true freedom only more or less, and that none is the perfect embodiment of the state presented in PR. To the extent that modern states realize the true idea of freedom, and so incorporate the forms of right set out in PR, philosophy justifies their basic structures. Otherwise, however, PR provides a rational standard of critique, by reference to which a state can correct itself. In other words, Hegel's PR becomes a critical theory of freedom based on reason. This is true especially of Hegel's idea of the corporation. Corporations were abolished in France during the Revolution and withered away in Britain. Yet Hegel takes corporations to be logically necessary components of a truly free, rational state. His normative theory of the corporation thereby becomes a critique, not an endorsement, of the contemporary status quo. This is evident in particular in Hegel's 1824-25 lectures, in which he states, I quote, "The task of the time is to form corporations, but people do not want to resolve to do so. The need is present, but people fear thereby acting against principles that hold abstractly." Since corporations for Hegel are made necessary by the logic of freedom, they cannot be rejected on the grounds that they are historically outdated. If they are absent in modern states, that is a reason for criticizing the latter, not for discarding the idea of the corporation. In Hegel's view, there are three principal causes of poverty in civil society. The first is mechanization. As labor becomes more abstract and mechanical, workers are eventually replaced by machines, lose their jobs, and thus fall into poverty. The second cause is the increasing difference in wealth between members of civil society. Those with greater skill attract more customers and build up more capital than others, and this then allows them to reduce the profit they make from each transaction, to sell their goods more cheaply, and so to attract even more customers. This in turn makes it harder for their competitors to make a living, and they thereby become poorer relatively as the successful producers become wealthier. As competition drives down wages, workers in turn are drawn into poverty by low pay. For Hegel, the generation of wealth thus goes hand in hand with increasing poverty. The third cause of poverty is overproduction. In civil society geared towards maximizing profit and wealth, principally for factory owners, productive capacity increases without limit or measure. Yet mass production and economic competition impoverish workers and some producers, thereby diminishing their ability to consume what is produced. Eventually, production exceeds society's capacity for consumption, and production has to be cut back, leading to unemployment and poverty. Note that Hegel is here not just describing empirically what happens in certain modern states. He argues that civil society, taken on its own or in the abstract, that is, without the corporations or the political state, gives rise logically, necessarily, to structural poverty. The more specific problem with civil society is that it is governed by understanding, Verstand, that is without limit or measure. Individuals are conscious of their right to own property and satisfy their needs and desires, but their understanding reaches beyond any limit that is set for it, and so generates what Aveniri calls a craving after unlimited desires, a craving for endlessly increasing wealth. In Hegel's words, wealth has no qualitative limit in it, and the pleasures of the business estate are insatiable, unersättlich, and measureless. The drive to maximize consumption and production leads, however, to increasing inequality, overproduction, and poverty. The latter, in turn, can thus increase without limit, which is one reason why Hegel describes poverty in England as a cancer, and he does so at least twice. Civil society taken on its own, therefore, is too rich to prevent poverty from arising, for it is precisely its excess of wealth and productive power that generates poverty. This is not to deny that the public authority, or Polizei, can take measures to alleviate the plight of the poor. It can control the price of basic necessities to keep them affordable, and it can provide financial support to the poor through a benefit system. The latter option, however, protects the needy without the mediation of work, and so gives them no feeling of self-sufficiency, and so can lead to so-called welfare dependency. The public authority can also seek to alleviate poverty by providing the poor with work. This, however, would increase the volume of production and simply compound the problem, for the evil consists precisely in overproduction and the lack of a proportionate number of consumers. Some suggest that this problem can be avoided if, following Keynes, the poor are employed in public works, such as road building, that do not directly increase the supply of goods, an option hinted at, by the way, by James Stewart, with whose writings Hegel was familiar. The problem with this suggestion, however, and also with the options of state welfare, increasing exports, and encouraging the poor to emigrate, is that they do not address what Hegel sees as the main issue, for none curbs the endless, measureless drive to maximize production and growth, the drive that for Hegel necessarily produces poverty. In this respect, civil society, regulated only by the police, is both too rich and too poor to prevent the emergence of systematic poverty. For Hegel, systematic poverty is not just the price we pay for prosperity. It is a violation of right, an injustice, Unrecht, and as such must be prevented from arising in a truly free, rational state. Moreover, in PR, Hegel does not claim that poverty is generated by such a state. It is generated by civil society that is still merely a state of the understanding, Verstandesstaat, an economic system driven by the understanding to seek limitless growth and regulated by the understanding in the form of the police, but without corporations or the political state, which are introduced in PR only after Hegel examines the problem of poverty. Hegel maintains that the corporations still belong to civil society rather than the political state, but he insists that they do not form part of the Verstandesstaat. Their role is rather to transform us from agents governed by understanding and selfish desires into ones that are rational and ethical. And in so doing, I contend, they prevent systematic poverty from arising in civil society. A corporation for Hegel is not just a profit-making company. It is principally a business or trade association that includes employers and employees working in a given branch of the economy. Corporations, however, also include local communities and towns, and even religious communities. Within the corporation, its members continue to satisfy their desires through their labor, and in this respect, their activity remains selfish, selbstsüchtig. Yet it ceases to be purely or even primarily selfish, because members also promote consciously the rights and interests of their fellows. Their activity is thus self-consciously ethical, sittlich. I care for my own well-being, but, quote, I also care for associates of the same trade for something universal. Members of a corporation also receive recognition from one another for their skill in their profession. Such recognition confirms the identity of each member as, for example, a hat maker or carpenter, and thus establishes that he is somebody in the eyes of his fellows. This recognition of one's abilities by one's peers means in turn that one does not have to seek recognition for oneself through external manifestations of success in one's trade, that is, through accumulating conspicuous wealth. Recognition within a corporation, together with the ethical spirit and habits cultivated in the latter, thus overcomes what Lisa Herzog calls the risk of unbridled consumerism that would otherwise prevail in civil society. Without the corporations, Hegel maintains, individuals enjoy no institutional recognition as subjects with particular capacities, rather than just abstract persons under the law. So they try to prove their worth and gain general recognition through external evidence, namely great wealth. There is, however, no intrinsic limit to such evidence, no point at which one is clearly rich enough to count as somebody. Individuals in a civil society without corporations are thus driven by their understanding to go beyond any limit they encounter and to strive for more and more wealth and luxury. In Hegel's terms, they seek the bad infant. As Hegel reminds us, however, the extravagance of the business classes is associated with the creation of a rabble. Civil society regulated by the police, but without corporations, necessarily produces poverty as a counterpart to great wealth, as can be seen in 19th century Britain. In England, Hegel remarks, there is the most monstrous poverty and rabble mentality, and a large part of this cancer is due to the removal of the corporations. Within the corporation, however, individuals no longer need to strive endlessly through understanding to go beyond their current wealth in order to prove their worth. Their selfhood no longer lies in an ever-deferred beyond. Rather, they are confirmed in who they are, and so, as it were, returned to themselves by the recognition they receive from their associates. They enjoy thereby the true infinity, the infinity of reason rather than understanding, that consists in finding oneself in and through the other in mutual recognition. The recognition we gain from our peers thus introduces a limit or measure to our economic activity that we do not need constantly to transcend. We must, of course, work to maintain such recognition and to satisfy our needs. Once an individual has been accorded recognition within a corporation, however, and here I quote Joel Anderson, the economically destabilizing need to prove himself through conspicuous consumption vanishes, and with it, the major cause of systematic poverty is removed. The corporations thus provide a solution to the otherwise intractable problem of poverty in civil society by transforming a mere system of needs regulated by an external authority into a society that is ethical and rational. Corporations also address the problem of overproduction by limiting their membership in light of the universal context and thus the number of people who can produce certain goods. In this way, they endeavor to keep production proportional to expected consumption and to avoid the excess production that puts people out of work. Such regulation can, of course, be undertaken by the police, but the latter is an external authority whose actions can appear malicious, gehässig. Within the corporations, by contrast, control of production is undertaken by producers themselves, and so in that sense is self-imposed. It is also recognized as serving the common interests of these producers and thus as ethical. Note that Hegel does not claim that the corporations will prevent the emergence of all poverty. Contingent poverty remains a possibility. Yet in a society with corporations, as Hegel conceives them, both production and consumption will be ethical, and supply will be regulated to keep it in balance with demand. The main causes of systematic poverty, extravagance and overproduction, will thus be removed. One should recall that civil society, as described in PR, before the emergence of the corporations, is an abstraction and does not exist in history in that pure form. In actual modern states, with developed civil societies but without corporations, the family, public education, and a sense of common citizenship or patriotism can all help to moderate the drive for ever increasing wealth. Not everyone in such states, therefore, will be as insatiable in their desires as in the civil society Hegel describes. Yet many will be insatiable. And if enough of them become great capitalists, Hegel's phrase, this will lead to systematic poverty. Note too that a strong sense of patriotism is not sufficient by itself to prevent such poverty from emerging, as we can see in 19th century England, which suffered from the most monstrous poverty, but also displayed great patriotism. This is because although the state engenders a sense of common purpose within its citizens, it does not make them ethical in their particular social and economic activity. For Hegel, therefore, the principal solution to the problem of poverty does not lie in the political state and its accompanying political disposition, as some commentators contend. It lies rather in the corporations, commercial and municipal, in which the so-called natural right to practice one's skill is raised to a conscious activity for a common end and thereby rendered ethical. One familiar objection to Hegel's conception of the corporation is that it excludes certain people and so leaves them exposed to the ravages of the market. There are, however, several responses to this objection. First, although Hegel says in his 1817-18 lectures that day laborers and servants are not members of corporations, he also says in the same lectures that, I quote, no one in the state may be permitted not to be a member of an association. Furthermore, as already noted, Hegel includes among recognized corporations not just business and trade associations, but also local communities and parishes. So in this respect, every member of the rational state, not just masters and their apprentices, can belong to a corporation. It is also worth noting that corporations do not just serve their own members, but also, I quote, paragraph 252, educate others so as to make them eligible for membership. Furthermore, they temper unbridled consumerism across the whole economy and thereby benefit everyone, even if some individuals, for whatever reason, should not belong to a corporation. Note that corporations do not prevent the diversification of needs, luxury, and some inequality of wealth. They do not, therefore, prevent economic growth. However, they ensure that the economy is not directed at maximizing growth and affording the few the chance to accumulate extreme wealth, but rather that society as a whole enjoys, I quote, the security of a smoothly continuing profit. They do so by integrating an ethical spirit into economic activity and so freeing us from narrow self-interest. Hegel's conception of ethical consumption and production, which generate neither extreme wealth nor systematic poverty, is, in my view, no mere ideal, unless we make it so by insisting rigidly on unrestricted freedom of trade. Indeed, Hegel's conception chimes, in certain respects, with the demands of contemporary environmentalists, who also urge us to adopt more ethical economic practices. Hegel's insight, however, is that neither moral education nor simple self-interest are sufficient to transform us into ethical agents, though both may be necessary to a certain degree. What is required are specific institutions, as we heard in the last paper, that educate us into ethical practices and partly regulate our activity. These institutions, which modern understanding abolished in the name of its abstract freedom, are the corporations. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this great talk. So go ahead and raise your hand and I will call on 3 presenters first and then we'll open up the floor. So,
oh my gosh, everybody's got the hand up on the screen.
We've got a lot of hands. Christopher Yeomans.
Oh, great. Thanks, Stephen. I thought it was a super interesting paper and on an often neglected topic. So I wanted to press you a little bit on the role that the corporations play in limiting overproduction, right? This is a kind of Fichtean theme in Hegel. It's one of those points where Hegel is saying things that are close to Fichte, but without the kind of rigorism. And I always find myself in this interpretive puzzle. Does he have the same view as Fichte and there's just a different personality to the author? There isn't that fanaticism there? Or is it really a sort of more moderated view? Because of course Fichte, both in the Foundations and the Closed Commercial State, wants to really make demand very stable, right? Precisely so that you can solve these problems of the distribution of professions and production and so on, right? But of course also, obviously Fichte thinks it's going to be done by the state in some sort of way. So what's interesting, I thought, about your contribution is you can see a way in which, no, the view really is quite different from Fichte. And we really are talking about another agent doing this. So a couple of questions here, I guess. Number one, I guess I wanted to ask, in what sense the agent doing this is still political in the relevant way, right? As you note, Hegel's using the term corporation in a very broad sense, which includes probably local governments, maybe, you know, redevelopment boards, maybe zoning boards and so on, right? In addition to things that we would now call unions and industry groups and so on. So I guess the first question is, to the extent that this function is going to be fulfilled by something like a corporation, to what extent is it going to be political, to involve that kind of authority in some way? And then I guess the second question is more forward-looking. Our experience with planned economies isn't very positive, right? And you might worry that in an economy of any kind of complexity, the sorts of calculations that are required to avoid overproduction in the absence of free market pricing mechanisms are unlikely to succeed. Do you think so? I guess the question is, if it's made local enough to a corporation or an industry, do you think that is that problem solvable? Two questions. Thanks.
Good. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for those questions. On the first one, I guess I've got a very simple answer, and that is that I think Hegel's use of the term political is really restricted to the state. Now, I know we use it in a much more generalized way, but Hegel thinks that towns, Gemeinden, communities, are corporations. And this was part of my question to Jean-François before, that they're not political. And so that's just a different usage of the term. So I would say, no, these agents are not at all political. The only, even in a sense that the Polizei, functioning simply as a public authority regulating the state, isn't political. What's political is the political state. Now, I don't know if that's a fair answer to your question, but I think that's how Hegel would deal with it. I think, though, you're absolutely right to highlight the sense in which the fact that local communities are also corporations and they can play a regulatory role. And you know, we're just going through, I don't know how much this has filtered across the Atlantic through, you know, Boris Johnson and his Tory cronies want to level up. Well, one of the ways you can level up is by giving control of economic development back to local regions and back to local towns. Now, that might well involve, in fact, you know, supporting certain industries in local regions and so on. So that's my answer to the first question. The response to the second question is to really emphasize that Hegel is not talking about a planned economy. You know, he does make that remark about Egypt, where he thinks that everything was, this is not a planned economy. So the corporations, first of all, are not established by the state. They're recognized by the state, but they're not established by the state. And secondly, the corporations themselves don't control what careers and so on people want to choose. In that sense, economic activity is still free. It's just that there's a licensing system. But I mean, we have that in Britain. You know, not everybody, I'm afraid, can become a doctor. There are controls on the number of places in medical schools. There are controls on teachers. These are restricted. It's not a free market in that sense. And so, but that doesn't mean to say that it's up to, you know, Smith or Jones to decide whether he or she wants to become a teacher. Now, the one question that I don't know, that it's implicit perhaps, although I'm going to attribute it to you even if you didn't say it, that I haven't mentioned here and that can complicate matters is the international dimension. You know, one of the things that is slightly problematic, you know, to what extent is this going to work? I've been considering this in isolation from the international dimension. And yes, what do you do if you're a state run on these ethical lines, you know, next to one that isn't? But Jean-François pointed out before, you know, we Europeans live with the US, and you know, we manage. Well, we used to manage until we opted out, rather stupidly. But anyway, so now the nitty-gritty economics of which is behind your question, I have to be honest and put my hand up and say I'm probably not qualified to answer. But I do, and that remark about the environmentalists wasn't just you know, a sort of a coy little remark. I mean, I really do mean it. I think there is an urgency for the economic activity to become ethical. But for the most part, people haven't tied that to poverty. They've tied it quite rightly to the economy. I want to reintroduce an urgency about poverty, because poverty is an Unrecht. It's wrong. It's not just an unfortunate consequence. So I think that, anyway, sorry, I hope that will suffice as an answer to your very good questions. Thanks, Chris. And good to see you, by the way.
Great, thank you. I'm going to just impose a requirement on the rest because we have so many hands. You just ask only one question, okay? So next is Arash.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I mean, you have already answered, you have already hinted towards my question, but I just want to press it a little bit further. So the issue is not, I don't think that, of course, all the things that Hegel says about corporations are fine, but the issue is whether the objective structure of economy allows for corporations to have the actual function that the desired function that they need to do this. I mean, especially there are two cases right now, I mean, in our world. One is the problem of the unemployed, and you touched upon it, but so the unemployed don't have any corporations, and you said that they can like enter into local communities or parishes, but how can like like some kind of local community solve the problem of the unemployed? The people don't have jobs for years and years and years, and I don't understand.
Okay, could I, sorry, just to, because I can respond immediately to your question, because I think there is a misunderstanding about what Hegel sees as the role of the corporations. So let me just say, yeah, my understanding here is that the corporations are not introduced to solve a problem of modernity. What Hegel is doing in the philosophy of right is not telling us what the modern state looks like. He's telling us what it is to be free. And he's setting out the components of a free state. And he is articulating the problems that arise if you leave out certain components. So in a way, when the corporations come in, they're not introduced into a world in which there's already the poor. They're there to stop poverty emerging. Now, there's a separate issue which Hegel also addresses in that quotation, that in the real world we're in, we need to reestablish corporations. Now, in that context, you're right, there will be corporations in a world where there's unemployed and the poor. And you're absolutely right, the corporations don't suddenly provide a way in which those people can be supported, except local communities might be able to help. But I don't think that's Hegel's main interest. I know it's our main interest in many ways, but Hegel's main interest is not to solve the problems of a broken state. That's not what he's doing. What he's doing is telling us what it is to be free. So my thought is that in Hegel's state as he understands, or rather in the free state, because it's not Hegel's state, in the free state as he understands it, where there are corporations, there is no systematic poverty. Now, we have got rid of the corporations, and bingo, we have systematic poverty big time. But what we've done is generate that poverty by insisting on unrestricted freedom of trade and the liberalism and stuff that Jay was talking about yesterday. Hegel then thinks, okay, in our real world, we need to do something about that. We need to change the way the economy works. And it's only going to happen if we abandon, or at least modify, this insistence on unregulated free trade. So I hope that makes it clear that in a way, the premise of your question is slightly misleading, because the corporations aren't established in a world in which there are already poor people. For us, yes, that will be the case if we want to reintroduce them, but that's not how they arise in the philosophy of right.
Yeah, but like economy has some kind of objectivity to it. I mean, okay, I mean, there is some kind of objective laws and regularities that is not.
Well, yes, up to a point, but only if you fixate on the system of needs. Remember, I mean, that is the reason I emphasize understanding, and one of the contributions I hope this paper will make is to emphasize the very important role that understanding plays in generating the system of needs. That Hegel's understanding of system needs is, or rather, the system of needs in Hegel's understanding is not purely material. It's understanding that generates the proliferation of desires and needs, and it's understanding that holds sway in civil society, and understanding needs to be turned into reason. And the corporations are a way of doing that. Now, if we just insist on the rule of the understanding, on the objective laws of the market, well, we're just, you know, we don't need, we should listen a bit more to Foucault, we should listen to Marx, we should listen to Hegel. That these are not natural limits.
Sorry to interrupt here, but since we have a number of people,
Sure.
then we can continue later.
Yeah.
So Bob, you're next. Bob Stern.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Stephen. That was great. I actually just wanted to, in a way, a quick question relating your paper to the previous one by Jean-Francois, because in that discussion of the paper and the paper itself, there was this rather nice sort of, well, idea that language might be an institution, and maybe that's a helpful way of thinking about what Hegel might be doing. But I wondered, and I was worrying about that as it was being put forward. And I'm wondering if you might agree with my worry in the sense that your paper, I think, makes really clear that the key thing for an institution for Hegel is that, as you say, it's transforming the self into broadly an ethical individual. Or at least that's why. It's no, I think somebody said, you know, why couldn't Hegel have put language in, you know, or not? I mean, it seems to me a reason to not count language as an Hegelian institution, unlike, you know, the institutions you've been discussing, like the corporations, is it doesn't have that transformative role. Now, you might try and give it that role. I mean, maybe there's some case to be made that language could do that somehow. But would you agree with that worry? I mean, as that's a defining feature of an institution as understood in this Hegelian project, as it were?
Well, if you don't mind, Bob, I'm not going to agree with that, no, because remember this, the administration of justice is also an institution, and it's not transformative. It's, you know, it's corrective and in some respects punitive. So not all institutions are transformative. I think that the corporations in relation to civil society are transformative. The polizei is not transformative either. This is one of the problems with the police and the administration of justice is that they deal with kind of given.
Yeah, transformative may be too strong a word, but it's dealing with the ethical issue of how you overcome, well, broadly self-interest, you know, an attitude that is opposed to the community or the general and so on. And yeah, some of that may mean control and some of it may need transformation. But the point is language, at least on the face of it, isn't doing any of that, right?
No, I agree with that. I think, I mean, one of the, obviously the situation in France is a little bit different from the situation in the UK, because they have the, you know, the Académie that has institutional status in overseeing, or used to anyway, a certain use of the French language. I think Hegel, no, language has the same status as thought for Hegel, in that it is a capacity of all mature subjects. And of course, right is an objectification of thought. I think somebody may have mentioned this yesterday, that there isn't a dualism between theory and practice. There is thought in these two different functions. The very idea of right presupposes thought and therefore language. So I don't think language, I agree with it, can't be a separate institution. It's not an objective institution in the way that the administration of justice or the state or the corporations can be. I agree with that. No more can any subjective capacity be an institution in that sense. Although one can, of course, set up institutions that regulate language, thought, and so on. I mean, I'm not sure I would want those particularly, but one could do that. So yes, I think I agree with your concern.
Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to prioritize folks who haven't had a chance to speak yet during the conference. So we'll have Sally and then Alan.
Oh, hi, Sally.
Well, hi, Steve.
Yeah,
thanks
hi,
so much.
Sally.
Yeah, that was really super. My question really, it's on page 6, where you talk about you're comparing the regulatory role of the corporations to that of police, and why it is, although police power can appear malicious or externally coercive, that's not the case with the corporations. And then the reason you gave for that is that the corporations, the production in the corporation is undertaken by the producers themselves, right? So the question I had is, it just reminded me of Kant's idea of a universal history, where he talks about the problem that we are all animals who need a master, but the problem is that we have to find that master in ourselves. So that is, you're suggesting that it's the producers themselves that exert a kind of have a regulatory role vis-a-vis the corporations on one hand, and yet you've been arguing that the corporations are supposed to, corporations play the role of moderating the desires of the workers, of the producers. So do you see the problem? Right, so on the one hand, you're suggesting that the producers exert a limiting role on the corporations, make it possible for corporations not to be malicious. On the other hand, corporations, you're arguing, and it sounds right to me, corporations are responsible for making us who we are, that is, for regulating our desires in the right kinds of way.
Yeah, thank you. I think you're slightly mischaracterizing the way that at least I understand the relationship between corporations and its members. And the corporation just is an institutional organization of its members. And the corporations, the corporations, I think, do two things. They transform us or educate us, bilden us internally. They make us into ethical beings, but they also regulate our activity. But they are us. Yeah. We are. It's not like there is the corporation us. Yeah. They're us. Yeah. But that's not the case with the Polizei. The Polizei is an external authority. Yeah. So does that help?
Yes.
A little bit.
It helps totally.
Yeah. Obviously, there is a sense in which if you're outside the corporation and you want to become a hat maker, but the corporation has this monopoly, then there is going to be something of an external constraint. Hegel thinks that's the price we have to pay. But remember that corporations also have a role to train and educate people outside them into, eligible members. So there's no reason why other corporations can't say to that person, well, look, have you thought about being a carpenter or thought about being something else? So.
No, the problem that I mentioned, I think, I think is just an apparent problem, and I just wanted to see how you handle it.
Okay, good. Thanks a lot. Anyways, good to see you.
Right. Next is Alan, and then after that will be Viren.
Thanks for that paper, Stephen. I completely agree with you that that the corporation is Hegel's answer to the problem of wrongful poverty, not poverty as such, not contingent poverty, but wrongful poverty. But I just want to ask you a question about not so much about poverty, but about the corporation on its political side. It's a bit tangential to your paper, but I'd really like to hear what you think about this. So I regard the corporation as part of, insofar as it's part of just the private sector, let's say, as not so fanciful. Given now the separation of ownership and control of the modern corporation, we can imagine the corporation, Hegel's corporation, emerging without the need for expropriations, right? And also given the development of collective bargaining, unions, we can imagine the corporation not as, we can imagine the industrial democracy of the corporation as something incremental now. So not so fanciful. But on the political side, as you know, Hegel wants to base political representation on the corporation. It's corporations that get represented, not atomistic individuals. And that seems to me a bit more of a stretch, given our modern consciousness. So I want to ask you whether you think that representation, political representation based on the corporation, is a necessary feature of the just state, or whether the individual-based representation that we have could somehow also be regarded as possibly compatible with Hegel's just state.
Okay, good, interesting question. Very briefly, obviously, the way I read the philosophy of right, the answer to your first question has to be yes. That representation through the corporation, which after all, Hegel says, is not representation, it is making interests present in the legislature. That's the crucial bit that I think I would want to keep. You know, let me just back up a little bit. I know this is not popular, but I'm going to say it anyway. Hegel's aim is not to help us solve the problems of modernity. It's not to get us from where we are, Jay's broken modernity, with which I have great, sympathy with his position, not to get us from there to a rational world. It's to tell us what rational freedom is. Now, he's not uninterested in the practical problem, but that's not his particular worry any more than it was Spinoza's. However, what can we learn from Hegel? If it is the case, as you said, that given our current consciousness, it's unlikely we're suddenly going to introduce corporate representation tomorrow. What could we take from this? What's important? What I think is important is the idea that the legislative assembly shouldn't just be full of representatives of numbers of people, but it should contain the actual interests, substantial interests in society. They should be given voice in that space. And they aren't under our system. What we do is have a kind of system where the largest number carries the weight. And that is, effectively might is right. Now, there is a way in which I think we can see an aspect of our system as being closer to Hegel than perhaps I've just said. And that is that, of course, constituencies count as communities. So if constituencies have something like a municipal, communal, corporate identity, then in fact, it seems to me that the representatives do more than just represent numbers. And I think under the British system, I'm not sure how it is in the US, that's how they're supposed to be. That the MPs go to Parliament not just to represent the numbers of people that voted for them, but the interests of that community. There was a terrible case yesterday of an MP being murdered. Well, we know that that guy represented the interests of his community. So I think that is something that we've already got, and perhaps we could build on that. But that's a practical problem. How do we reorganize our legislative assemblies so that they make space for interests to be present, not just numbers of people to be represented. The other thing is, even though Hegel's setting out what it is to live in a true state, a free state, he also says the state in history is not a work of art. It's going to have imperfections. So I don't think the idea is that we're supposed to somehow, at some point in history, get to the absolutely free rational state in all its fine detail. We're going to have to make compromises. But I think the way we do things at the moment, as we did in Britain, by making a huge decision on the spur of the moment, simply on a 51% majority, was idiocy. And it's idiocy whether you support Brexit or not. We did it on the weight of numbers. Now that strikes me as not an intelligent way to decide political decisions. So I would want to learn, from Hegel in that respect. I don't know if that helps.
All right, we've got Vera next, and then after that will be Matthew.
Yes, thank you for this. I really enjoyed this presentation, and I think I I agree with what you're trying to do with the corporations, but I have a question about the causes of poverty, because I think that's crucial to how the corporations actually work. So when you begin the paper, you talk about these three causes, right? And one of them are overproduction, and then there's like competition and so on, which seem to be very much connected to the logic of civil society and the logic of the market and capitalism. But then as you go further into the paper, it seems like what all of these causes are sort of reduced down to the pursuit of unlimited consumption or the pursuit of wealth. And here, the distinction between wealth and profit might be useful, because there is a sense in which profit is sort of abstract wealth, and you can conceive of a capitalist who is driven by market forces to pursue profit, even though personally he's not that extravagant, right? Because there's a difference between that personal pursuit of I'm thinking of like the famous capitalist in India, Narayan Murthy, who was very famous for being a Gandhian. He was very simple. But when he's pursuing profit, that's because there's another logic. And so the corporations seem to have to deal with both of these logics. On the one hand, deal with, okay, there's one thing about conspicuous consumption, but there's something else that's going on when you're talking about the pursuit of abstract wealth. That is, and so I don't. Do you see my point?
Well, I'm not sure that there's really a difference. I mean, the first thing you said, I think, is absolutely right, that the causes of poverty that Hegel is discussing are generated by the logic of civil society as he's conceiving it. And that is an abstraction. We need to remember that there aren't states, there are states that are closer or further away from that pure civil society. But I don't think there are any states around that are pure civil society in that sense. That's not what Hegel's saying. But the idea is that the logic of civil society will generate poverty. But I'm not sure I quite understand the difference you're highlighting at the end, because for Hegel here, the very nature of the way needs get proliferated relies not just on our material bodily needs, but our imagination, our understanding. It's our understanding that moves in the direction of greater refinement of needs, that generates a division of labor, for example. So it's, in a way, Hegel's account of the system of needs is far less materialist than might appear. Understanding is crucial to this. And so the market might be, you're right, that people get caught up in that. And they may be very, very moderate people in their own right, but when they get caught up in that system, there are market forces that drive them to do things. But the whole system is a function of a certain kind of understanding. And it's that understanding that needs to be changed. And the corporations, I think, do that. The other point I just want to highlight again, which I think is really important, is this idea of measure, of limit. Hegel will use this over and over again. Ohne Grenze, maßlos. Civil society is without limit, it's without measure. And it reminds me of, I think it's the beginning of book 2 of the Republic, when they're talking about, there's the city of pigs, and the city of pigs is fine because that's just when we're dealing with our own needs. But then once we have a human system, we lose any measure. And so how do we reintroduce measure again? Well, the whole discussion of justice is partly to, a way of reintroducing measure. I see the corporations as a way of reintroducing a measure into that measurelessness. Now, I'm interested in this because, I've just been working on the logic of measure in my book. So, but I think it's something that often gets overlooked when we think about civil society. So I don't know whether that answers your question or not, but maybe it can do for the time being.
Yes,
right.
Thank you.
But thanks for the question. Thank you.
Matthew?
Hi. Yeah, I'll try to be quick here. Thanks for the talk. I'm very sympathetic with what you're saying about the corporations. But I guess I'm actually not sure where you stand on this. And I wanted to ask, do you think that poverty for Hegel by itself poses an ethical problem? And because it seems to me, for instance, in Hegel's distinction between the poor and the rabble, that poverty by itself is not on its own an ethical problem. So for instance, you know, you can imagine a kind of working poor who has like a kind of, you know, a non-mechanical, you know, relatively secure, safe job as not, you know, as not necessarily posing an ethical problem on Hegel's picture. And so in that case, you know, is the problem that the corporations, which they're supposed to solve, is that problem, is it poverty per se, or is it something else? So
good, very good question. Thank you very much for that. I think that is spot on. I would say that the rabble, the phenomenon of the rabble, is definitely an ethical problem, because as Hegel understands it, rabble mentality, and remember there's a rich rabble as well as a poor rabble, and let's not just blame the poor, there's a rich rabble too, and it is marked by a lack of respect, and in fact it gets very contradictory, because Hegel says that Recht haben, always wanting to be right, always insisting on your entitlements, is a kind of Pöbelhaftigkeit. So I think that's absolutely right. And I won't say any more about that. But poverty, I don't think poverty is principally an ethical problem. What it is a violation of the right that's set out in paragraph 121. It's a violation of the moral right of the subject to find satisfaction through action. Remember, now this is why I think that the background to the whole account of poverty is in the section on abstract right and morality. You've got the abstract right to own property. Well, the poor often can't do that. That's denied them. But they're also denied the satisfaction of their needs and desires through their own labor. And I think that's why poverty is an Unrecht, even if there were no rabble. But the rabble is an extra component that I think you're right is ethically problematic as well. Rabble is an unfortunate term, and we talk about, you know, underclass, but I mean, we know what he means, where a certain kind of indignation, resentment builds up. Not all poverty produces that, and Hegel never says that. So I don't know, does that answer your question?
Yeah, good. I mean,
thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Okay, we've got, I think, our last question for the talk, although we'll be going to lunch. So if Stephen wants to hang around and field more questions,
Yes.
sort of an interim, you know.
Yeah, it's only 5 o'clock here, and
Right.
so it's not lunch for me. That's fine.
Great.
So I'm happy to hang around a bit.
So our last question is from Jonas.
Sorry, thanks very much for your talk. I found this very interesting. I have a question about the role of education you bring in at the end of your paper. And the question is that I totally see the point that education fulfills the same goal as corporations in terms of orienting or ending selfishness and limiting competition and turning it towards universality. But there is, and this is my question, there is a point way prior to the cooperation part in the philosophy of right, where Hegel talks about education in the civil society, and there he says it has to be a hard work of the subject to get to universality, to limit one's own needs. And it is a work done within the subject, is then what Hegel writes. So there it appears, or it appears as like the universal remains something outside of the subject, and the subject has to work to get there. It's not already within the universal, but it has to get there through hard work. And the way you talked about the corporations seems to be another picture that we are, like you said before, we are already in the universal in some way because we are members of the corporation. We're within. And now I wonder if, as you put it, education and recognition or education and cooperation come very close together. And I wonder if there is not an aspect of education in Hegel which fulfills the same goal, but in a totally different way, in a more subjective, individual, and not in this social way of mutual recognition within the corporation. So how do you relate these?
Yes, I mean, I think that's a very good and helpful question. Thank you. And I'm just sort of going through my mind and thinking, well, there's obviously education through schooling. I mean, Hegel is, thinks that children have a right to be educated and parents have an obligation to educate them. So there's clearly that dimension of education. There is also, and I'm looking now at paragraph 197, that both the theoretical and practical education that happens within the system of needs itself, and that is very much a kind of discipline that is imposed upon us by the fact that through the division of labor and so on, we get brought into interchange with others, and we have to accommodate some of our desires to those of others, and that perhaps fits what you're talking about, that kind of hard having the rough edges broken off us. Then of course there's the estates that have more formal principles. There's the principle that belongs to the universal state and the business state and so on. That again brings about a certain kind of education. But the logic that Hegel's tracing indicates that none of these is sufficient to stop poverty arising. And I base that on or maybe this sounds a bit clunky, and I'm sorry about this, but I do think the order in which everything gets discussed in the philosophy of right is really important. And the fact is that after all of this, we get poverty. Now, not everybody in civil society is impoverished, and particularly not when you think that actually civil society is an abstraction, and in modern states, often, it's a small number, except, they're, in Britain, at least it's millions, we're talking millions. So what do the corporations do that's different? Well, I think that they educate and inform their members with a spirit that is particular to their social and economic activity, rather than just, not pushing old ladies over in the street. I mean, families and schools can deal with that, but that's what the corporations do. And of course, they provide another level of education that is institutionally grounded and it's built in with recognition. And it is not simply a matter of the sort of hard school of hard knocks that you go through in civil society. But the one doesn't exclude the other. I think if that's what you're getting at, absolutely. And I didn't mean, I mean, obviously this is only the 20-minute version, but I suppose what I want perhaps to add here is that the presence of the corporations is not, I think, as some commentators think, like Alan Wood, incompatible with a market that is to a certain extent free. And so some of those things that Hegel says about the civil society remain the case. Civil society is not eliminated with the corporations. It is transformed, and an ethical moment is introduced that tempers what we're doing. But it's still the case that we're interested in ourselves. We have to accommodate ourselves to the interests of others. We get involved in production and exchange. And so that dimension of education that he's talking about in paragraph 197 still holds. So yes, I think I agree. If I've understood your question correctly, I think I agree with what you said.
Okay, thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Stephen for this excellent paper.
Thank you.
And also Paul and Jean-Francois, it's been a lovely session today. So if you're game for staying on, Stephen, Dean has offered to continue moderating. We've got 4 hands up, so I will, but only so long as you're interested, Stephen. So we're gonna come back in 45 minutes.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, it's 5:15. I had lunch quite a while ago. We're not eating dinner till a bit later. So I think I'm okay. And if I keel over, then you'll know I've had enough. So yeah, so if that's okay. So Dean, if you don't mind moderating, that would be great. And you can moderate me as much as the speaker, as much as the questions, in case I go on too long.
Great. Yeah. So everybody should just feel free to check out if you want to, and we'll keep this going for maybe another 20 minutes. I don't want to give you no break, Stephen.
Right, yeah, maybe to 1/2 or something, like 15 minutes.
Past,
That would be good.
15 minutes.
Thank you.
Yeah, Mark, we're going to finally get to you. I just to one word though before you start is we did ask everybody at the very beginning to wait to raise your hand until the speakers are finished. All right, Mark, go ahead.
Stephen, what you said is the reason why I'm going on a hunger strike without water until death here in the next day. I'm out here in this clothing because it's cold outside in my car, but I'm actually camped outside of a highway because of Hegel and what I've dedicated my life towards, which is ending the poverty that I was born into. So I'm 35, I've been doing this about 20 years, and what you said about the states and the difference between the understanding and the rational state is 100% how I read it. And I was talking to Robert Wallace and a few other Oxford scholars about this new interpretation of history where it's not just slaughter bench, slaughter bench, slaughter bench, slaughter bench, but eventually the state becomes so developed through science, through this education, what you're saying is the corporation's duty, that we actually get to a blessed history, the universal history that the other woman was talking about earlier, and that we overcome the slaughter bench or the negation, not by eliminating it naively, because it's the engine history, but that we internalize it through science. It becomes explicitly the process of self-recognition, a lot more harmonious, a lot more immediate. So what I'm trying to do with this hunger strike is bring in, these universals, this Weltgeist, so that we can upgrade our society from this abstract science we have, which is separating us, into this more universal, infinite science, which Hegel talks about in the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences, and that the corporation should be teaching the logic so that people become less self-serving and more universal. So my question to you is, do you think it would be great to create an app? We're creating an app with this hunger strike called the Worldwide Essential Workers app, where I think the corporation is still stuck in the particular. Its function is to get people to realize the logic so that they become civil servants as a deeper form of self-recognition, where you blend the corporation and the state and the individual all in one in a blessed history, and that an app, a worldwide app, where the workers own the means of production, which is the corporate side, but they have that universal self-consciousness through the education of the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences. That's part of the orientation of the work that they're going to do. So do you think this is a good idea? I might be dead in like 6 days. I really want you guys to get on board because nobody else understands Hegel besides maybe my family a little bit. And I'm having a heck of a time convincing all these Uber, Skip, and DoorDash drivers who got screwed during the pandemic. But I'm running out of time, and I really love what you say. And I think we are the spirit that can change the world.
Did we lose Stephen there? Stephen will hopefully rejoin us to help answer your question, Mark.
You're muted.
I'm really sorry about that.
Oh, there he is.
We just had a problem with our internet at the house. So I'm sorry about that. I hope Mark is still there. I only heard a little bit of your question. But one thing, forgive me for saying this, it's probably inappropriate, but I would say it anyway. I would strongly urge you not to be damaging your health like that. There are other ways in which you can bring the attention of the public to the urgent issue of poverty. I've got students I'm responsible for. I've got young people of my own. I've got children who are older than you are. So I really, really would recommend, Mark, that you not.
I've been doing it for 20 years. There's no way. We're trapped. Uber is moving too fast. We have to do it now. And Hegel says we have to risk it all. Like in self-consciousness.
But you do it through institutions and also by staying healthy. But anyway, that's just a preface. Now, could you just very, very briefly repeat your question? Because I'm afraid I lost you. So just briefly, just repeat your question, and then I'll see if I can respond to it. And apologies for coming off.
Rates of change are the problem here. These apps like Uber, Skip, and DoorDash are moving too quickly, and it's actually causing this rabble response too quickly. So we have to do something drastic. So I think creating an app that the workers own called the Worldwide Essential Workers app can fulfill this role of the corporation, except increase the educational component through the science of logic while they're doing the work. And if we make it worldwide, then we can actually prevent this incredible wealth transfer, which might get us to a point where we can't break out of the negative moment of reason and achieve that higher rational state worldwide. I think that Uber is a very wrong-spirited organizations.
Okay, so I'm just going to stop you there, Mark, because I understand, but I don't think this is not the appropriate place to be doing a kind of a presentation in that respect.
Where?
I think
Where
what I would say, what I think, sort of looking at it from a strictly Hegelian point of view, my understanding is that, I mean, I ended up by saying that, you know, moral education, for example, and simple self-interest are not enough, that what is required for Hegel are certain specific institutions within civil society that need to render activity ethical. Now, the way you were talking about it, a worldwide app, for example, doesn't seem to me to be specific, and if I can put it this way, local enough for the kind of thing that Hegel's concerned with. I think I mean, it may be a good idea on its own. I mean, that's for you to decide. But I think if we're looking at it with Hegelian eyes, and if we're not going to be in a position immediately to be able to introduce the corporation as he understands it, then we need to work through local communities. Because communities, parishes, they are also corporations for him.
That's why
and there's no reason why local communities can't take on the task of ensuring greater economic fairness of opportunity for their members.
It has to be local and global. It can't be one-sided. It has to be both.
Let's move
okay,
on.
well,
Yeah, thanks very much for that. I mean, I sympathize with the idea that you have to go global to meet the global problem. But yeah, I think at some point we run out of resources in Hegel to address today's issues. But thank you. I think we just have time for Jake and Esther. I don't know that we can go any longer than that, or Stephen, we should ask Stephen to go any longer than that. So Jake.
Thanks, I really enjoyed this. I wanted to just return to an issue you raised at the outset, and which is like, what weight or significance should we give to the fact that we haven't solved this problem since Hegel's time? And I kind of got the sense that, you know, your perspective is, well, you know, that's no strike against, that's not on Hegel, that's on us. Or, you know, it's not actually that important that we live in a world where poverty is rife, because we took a wrong turn. We didn't go the correct.
No, hang on. I absolutely did not say it's not important.
Well, I know. I'm
I'm not accepting that.
Fair enough.
I said it's not, certainly it's not Hegel's principal concern as a philosopher, and for us, it's not our principal concern as philosophers to solve the problems of modernity. As human beings, it is absolutely our concern.
Yes.
Absolutely our concern. And of course, we're not just philosophers. But Hegel is very much like Spinoza, it seems to me. And I teach Spinoza, I love Spinoza, and understanding is an end in itself for Spinoza. It is a form of freedom on its own, and so is philosophy for Hegel. But we're not just philosophers. We have a religious life, we have an aesthetic life, we have a political, we have an economic life. And what philosophy helps us see clearly in our political economic life is that poverty isn't just an unfortunate byproduct of prosperity. It is wrong. And so, of systematic poverty. And so it is very important that we do something about this, and maybe we can learn from him about how to try and deal with this problem. But I don't think as a philosopher, that is the principal concern of Hegel's.
I understand, and I'm sorry for mischaracterizing you. I just think there's a deeper issue here. It's one I'm interested in, one I think is difficult. I don't really know how to solve, is that it sometimes seems to me as if Hegel, maybe he doesn't think might makes right, but he thinks right has a kind of might to it. We should expect it to prevail. We should expect it to happen. We shouldn't, you know, in a way it's a knock on something if we look out in the world or in history and see, well, it's really not, you know, not managing to survive out there. There's a kind of very Marxist version of that view too. Marx and Engels always talking about how things go under and attributing a great significance to that. I'm just wondering if, you know, I mean, I have this very flat-footed reaction, but I'm not so sure it isn't an authentically Hegelian Marxist one of, well, if this were the solution, it would, you know, it would have prevailed, or it would have stood up against the kind of forces that were against it. Or
I think your premise is mistaken.
Right.
You've got to ask yourself, why is Hegel so worried about the various things he's worried about? Why is he so worried about the Romantics? He's constantly attacking them. Why is he always going on about the problems with the English. You know, I mean, he's steeped in England. He reads the Morning Chronicle. He reads the Edinburgh Review. But then he says, we don't have a proper sense of right. You know, our society is struck through with privilege and so on. So I think he's acutely aware of the deficiencies of modernity in an aesthetic sense. He complains about priests who don't give their flock the salt that they need. Because, and he even says, actually, if you've read any of the lectures on the philosophy of right, when he's talking about what the poor are deprived of, he says they're deprived of the enjoyment of religion. And he says one of the problems is that many of the priests are so well educated that they can't speak to the people who need the religious solace, and they won't go into their houses. It's quite dramatic stuff. So I think he's acutely aware of the deficiencies of modernity. But if there is one, and this is overly simplistic, so forgive me for this, if there is one problem that I think underlies all of it, it is Verstand. I wrote an essay many years ago called The Triumph of Verstand in Modernity. And I think if you look everywhere, it's Verstand, it's Verstand, it's Verstand. It's understanding that emphasizes, you know, the absolute nature of freedom of trade, let's say, or the liberalism Jay was talking about yesterday. And so I think there are moments when you're right, when he does say the idea will triumph. But actually, I think that the more we get into modernity and the more freedom becomes a matter of self-conscious understanding of that freedom, in some respects, also the more vulnerable we get. Because what happens if our understanding is deficient? Then we're really screwed. And also the problem is, and I think people have said this, philosophy is not going to be the best way to get everybody. I mean, who's going to be sitting down and reading the philosophy of right on the train going to work in the morning? I mean, they're just not going to do it. So I don't want, I think the problems of modernity are urgent. I think Hegel does have some things to say, but I don't think he's perhaps as naive or, you know, like Boris Johnson, kind of, you know, boosterish, saying, yeah, we can do it, sort of thing, as perhaps you might feel. So right isn't might. Right should dominate. I think that's really true, but I don't think right is might, actually. I wish it were a little bit more, perhaps.
Thanks.
Is that helpful? Good. Nice to meet you, by the way.
Yes, yeah.
Thanks, Stephen.
Yes.
Well, Esther's been waiting a long time. I appreciate the rest of you have your hands up, but I don't think we're going to get...
Well, is that, I mean, what time is it?
We have 12:29 here.
Yeah, you know, I don't mind, Dean. I mean, we start at 6, don't we? As long as I can have about 15 minutes or so, 20 minutes maybe. Let's go for a few more minutes. If there are a couple of other people, I'm happy to.
Esther, if you could keep it short, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for your talk. I found it very interesting. I have a question, and that relates to paragraph 63 and 64 from the philosophy of right, which is obviously about value and about money. So in your talk, and I think, I mean, I'm coming from a more Marxist tradition. So this is of course very important because here Hegel outlines the problem of money insofar as it represents value as such, ein Zeichen für Wert, but it's not representing any use value in particular. And this is precisely why the desire for money is limitless and measureless, right? Because it is die Möglichkeit of every value, but the actuality of no value. So my question is like, in your own work then, if we talk about the corporations on the one hand, and our means to represent and produce value, and also exchange useful things. What place does money have in your account?
Mm-hmm.
If we talk about poverty and limitlessness.
Right. Just give me 1 second. Okay.
Sure.
If I can find this. Okay. Are you still there, Esther? You've gone. Just say something. Esther,
No, I'm still here. I'm still
good.
here.
That's right. Yeah, someone else appeared. So, okay. Right. I'm going to be shamelessly self-promoting. Okay. Do you know this book? Can you see it?
I do know the cover indeed. Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, there's an article in there by me.
Okay.
And the article is on property use and value in Hegel's philosophy of right. Mm-hmm. And it ends with a brief 4-page comparison of Hegel and Marx on value.
Okay.
So that's the one thing I would say. But very briefly,
yes,
I think this is for me, this is the place in which Hegel and Marx differ most significantly, actually. Forget, idealism, realism, materialism, blah, 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 blah. I think it's the question of value, and particularly the relation between quality and quantity. And although obviously we know, and you know, that for Hegel, any commodities, I mean, they can't have an exchange value unless they've got a use value. No one's going to buy the flaming thing. But the use value doesn't enter into determining the exchange value. Whereas I think for Hegel it does. It does. So in fact, the exchange value, or he just calls it value of a good, is in one sense abstracted from the utility or the quality of a thing, but it is not completely abstracted from it. And the reason, and so there's a much closer, there's a residue, if you like, of quality that gets preserved within quantitative value for Hegel. And that's because ultimately what qualitative, I'm looking at paragraph 63, you mentioned 64 and 65, but 63 is the important one, I think.
Yes, exactly.
Where he says that what value, and by implication money does, is allows needs to be comparable. So ihre spezifische Brauchbarkeit ist zugleich als quantitativ bestimmbar vergleichbar. So the Brauchbarkeit becomes vergleichbar. But that means that in the expression of that equivalence, the Brauchbarkeit is not completely lost sight of. Now, Dean should be answering this because he's written a great big book on value. But anyway, that's how I see it. Now, I think for Marx, that's not the case. So my understanding, and I don't know whether you would agree with this, but my understanding is that for Marx, the problems with capitalism don't arise with surplus value. They don't arise with the proletariat. They arise with the very institution of exchange. That's already a problem for Marx, because to have an exchange value is already to be, if you like, alienated somewhat from qualitative utility. And when labor power gets commodified, then, if you like, human beings are reduced to quantities in some way. I don't think that's the case with Hegel. So that would be my broad response to you. Now, all I can do is, as again, being shamelessly self-promoting, is push you in the direction of that article. See what you have to think. If you don't agree, email me, we can talk about it further.
Yeah,
does that help? Yes.
I'd be happy to
Dean,
talk about it.
You come in, you say something, because it's your topic.
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to talk about it too. I have a long discussion in the book, and also about how Hegel reworks it in the lectures after that, those very sections. But I also draw on Stephen's article, which is excellent. Michael, or is it Michelle? Why don't you go ahead, and then we have Andrew, and then we really will have to stop.
Then we stop, yes. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Hello.
Yes.
Nice to meet you.
Hello, Professor Houlgate. I'm Michel Martinez from Venezuela, and I was very moved by your article because I think I'm part of the reasons, or part of let's say part of the reasons I am able to be here listening to all of you. I mean, organizers talk, professors talking, is because what the values that organize what you call corporations, because I come from a working class family, and in this working class family, I mean, I was encouraged to become an English teacher. I'm an English teacher in my country.
Good.
And thanks to that, then I decided to study philosophy, and I became a Hegel reader. Thanks to you, thanks to Professor Pinkard, Professor Pippin, and it was incredible for me to see that Hegel was able to be read in this way. And well, so my question would be, like, I would like you to speak a little bit more about the place of education in terms of this corporation. If there is any development that Hegel could help us in order to understand what is the place of education, or of course he has a form to talk about, or he has a, sorry, I'm very nervous. He has developed this, but I'd like you to develop it a little bit more in terms of what is the place of education. Because, for example, in my case, I'm thinking about, now that I have the resources to be like economically stable, I'm thinking about, for example, giving the opportunity to all the working class kids or to learn English as well and be able to develop themselves and overcome this systematic poverty. So that's why this.
Okay, all right. Okay, I'll try and keep it brief, obviously, because the time is short. But anyway, nice to see you, and I'm pleased to hear of your career development and that you're teaching, which is great. My wife's a teacher, and son's a teacher, and the other son's a teacher. So I believe very much in teaching. I was asked, a similar question earlier about education. So what I think is specific about the education in a corporation, from which we might be able to learn, is, it doesn't necessarily teach us to be good at maths or to learn about history or anything like that. But it does teach us ethical value. It teaches us to recognize one another, and but not just to recognize one another in a kind of vague and woolly way, but to recognize one another for the skills and talents and abilities that one has. And the corporation also provides a context in which those skills can be presented. Now, I think that's quite important. So obviously you're not in a corporation in the same way, because presumably they don't exist. I don't know. But I think the idea of providing a space in which people are able to show their talents and also then give them recognition for doing so, I think that's really an important element of what the corporations provide. And, I was listening on the radio yesterday to a British comedian called Billy Connolly, who you probably have not heard of, but he's really funny. But he was saying about being brought up in Glasgow, in Scotland, in part of Scotland, and the fact that he was always given the impression that he wasn't worth anything. Now that's terrible. That is a terrible thing to do. And it seems to me that corporations would not allow that among the members. Now, it seems to me that we do that in a lot of areas of society. We give people the impression that they don't matter, that they're not worth anything. And we then also don't give them the space in which they can prove what they can do. So I guess that would be my rather simple-minded lesson I would draw. Let's assume we can't have Hegel's corporations. What can we rescue from his idea? I would say that's what I would rescue, and I think everybody can take that on board, and that can be part of our everyday experience. And obviously, when I'm teaching, presumably you're teaching, one of the things we want to do is not just say, oh, you're wonderful when people obviously aren't, but train them to develop their capacities and then give them recognition when they do that, so that they don't feel, oh, nobody thinks I'm any good. Which is, I'm afraid, what a lot of us do, and what our education system often does.
Well, thanks to your teaching, I was able to.
Yeah. Anyway, well, good luck with your reading and with your teaching, and maybe see you again sometime.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay,
thank
bye-bye.
you. Andrew, this is really the last question for Stephen before we let him go. Go ahead.
Hello, Stephen. Thank you for that talk. It's so useful for what I'm doing. It was incredible. But I have one question. And that's to do with.
You know what, Andrew? Sorry, I'm just going to interrupt.
Okay.
Because we know one another, and you're at Warwick.
Yeah.
Why don't we have a little session together sometime? I mean, you put your question now, but I might be brief. But if you would like, if you'd like to have a sort of a half an hour chat sometime on Teams, let's do that. But in the meantime, ask a question.
It's just a quick.
Yeah,
it's fine. We can talk about it later. It's just a very quick question. It seems to me that corporations can be in competition with another. I'm not talking about normal. Yes. I'm not normal companies. I'm talking about when those corporations compete in the same market, but are actually separate trades and professions.
Yeah.
So what then sort of then controls and regulates that? I mean, obviously the state, but how does the state do that is the question.
Well, Hegel says it has oversight. I mean, the state either the public authority, once you get to the state, is shown to be part of the executive. So the executive power of the state, Hegel says, has oversight. And he puts it in that way. So I think that it can also see the effects of foreign markets and so on. Excuse me. So I think that's his answer. You're absolutely right. And obviously I've underestimated that because I want to emphasize the positive side of corporations, but they still only imbue their members with a sense of a particular universality. And that particular universality, because it's particular, can be at odds with other particular universalities. However, Joel Anderson points out that people can be members of different, if you live in a community and in a parish and you're a member of this corporation, you can be a member of 3 different corporations. So individuals can be part of different corporations. But your point is absolutely right. And I don't think Hegel has any answer and can have any answer other than the state overseeing this and reminding the corporations, and indeed preventing the corporations from becoming what Hegel thought they were in France. I mean, one of the things that one thinks about the role of Louis XIV. One of the things that Louis XIV was able to do was centralize the state in order to break the power of the aristocracy, but also, I suppose, of the Parlement, which were kind of the corporations. And so part of developing a unified modern state is not to allow corporations to become states within states. I'm not aware at the minute of any other solution that he has, but it's a good question. So I'm going to leave it to you to see whether you think that's sufficient.
Okay, thank you, Stephen.
Good. Okay. All right. Good.
Great.
I'm just going to stay on, Dean, if it's right, and just have a brief chat with David. Is that allowed, or do you need to close us all down? I mean, otherwise we can catch up on another occasion. I don't want to make things awkward to you. If you prefer to close us down, I'll wave to David, and then maybe he and I can have a chat on another occasion. It looks like you want to do that, so maybe
I think that might be better, given that I think everybody needs to.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Hi, David. A bit of downtime.
Good to see you. Maybe we can talk again, David, sometime.
Yeah, I can call you, for instance, on Zoom.
Should we do that? Let's set up a chat. We can just catch up a bit. That would be great.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Yes. All right. See you later then. Thank you, everybody, and thanks, Dean. Bye-bye.